Welcome back, everyone. We are going to get into how we're going to help people pay for these treatments that we've talked so much about. And for that, I've got a wonderful panel here, moderated by Jon Purow from Zuber Lawler. So, Jon, I'm going to hand it right over to you to introduce your panel and kick things off.
Great. Thank you so much, Marnie. So before I introduce myself and we get going, I just want to do my customary prayer to the video chat gods. May our children and dogs be quiet. May Amazon not deliver anything to us during the panel, and may our Wi-Fi be sturdy. All right, so as Marnie said, my name is Jon Purow. I'm counsel at Zuber Lawler. Our firm is comprised of 45 attorneys and 7 offices across all practice areas with top pedigrees and experience. I actually only got in on an athletic scholarship, to be honest. So we focus on highly regulated industries such as cannabis, and we have an expanding client base in psychedelics, serviced by our intellectual property attorneys, our Yale-educated pharmacologist, and an FDA attorney that obtained the first GRAS designation for a hemp product. And with that, I want to hand it off to each of our panelists to introduce themselves as modestly or however they want to handle it as possible. First off, I want to hand it over to Lucia Huang of OSMIND.
Awesome. Thank you, Jon, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm super excited to be here and to talk about everyone's favorite topic, which is how are we going to pay for these amazing new therapies? A little bit about myself. I'm co-founder and CEO of OSMIND. We're an early stage mental health startup focused on bringing better software and insights to clinicians and researchers working with the most innovative mental health treatments out there. In terms of my own background, I've been in the healthcare world for a number of years. I've always been focusing on healthcare companies on the business side. So I started out in investing at Warburg Pincus, which is a growth stage healthcare investing company focused on healthcare IT. And then I moved over to a neuroscience biotech startup called Verge Genomics based in San Francisco, where I helped to lead the company on everything non-scientific related and really fell in love with where the whole field of neuropsychiatry is going and how much those patients needed help. So when I was at Stanford a few years ago, I met my co-founder there who was at the med school, and I had completed my business school degree. And we both bonded over our shared interest and excitement for psychedelic medicine and beyond. In fact, Stanford actually had their first official psychedelic medicine course as part of the med school a few years ago. So we really saw that it was just the beginning of finally the revolution that we need in psychiatry to help these patients. And so we co-founded OSMIND about 1.5 years ago to really help clinicians and researchers have better software and better data to influence the better treatment and development of new therapies. So really excited to be here today to talk a little bit about our work and about the work that Carlene and Owen are doing as well.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carlene MacMillan of Brooklyn Minds.
Awesome, thanks so much. So my name is Dr. Carlene MacMillan. I am the co-founder and CEO of Brooklyn Minds and am an adult and child psychiatrist by training. At Brooklyn Minds, I think we were the first practice in New York City to implement esketamine when it was FDA approved. We have a very active program where we sort of go the extra mile to get insurance coverage. My interest in getting adequate insurance coverage also extends across kind of interventional treatments for severe mental illness. With that, I'm on the Clinical TMS Society's insurance committee. And it turns out, as we'll talk about today, there are many parallels that can be translated to the psychedelic world. I also have the pleasure of working with Lucia, both as being on her clinical advisory board, as well as on something called the ketamine task force, where we're working to get payers like Medicare to cover ketamine infusions. So happy to be here.
Great. And last but not least, I'll hand it over to Owen Muir of Spear Health to introduce himself as well.
Hi, I'm Owen Muir. I'm a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist. I'm also married to Carlene, and she's my boss at my day job, which is Brooklyn Minds. My first job was in the music industry, where I had to deal with payola pretty early on. And then after I went to medicine, I realized like payola alive and well, but it's totally legal here. That's awesome. One of the things that's really remarkable about psychedelics is as we saw from Nolan's talk, Dr. Williams pointed out the effect sizes are huge. And so my hypothesis and our hypothesis at Sphere Health is that value-based care is going to be the future that lets us get these tremendously valuable treatments to patients in ways that don't cost them a lot of money, but generate a lot of value for the system and for capital markets, which honestly is probably the only way we're going to get this to people at scale. Because on a fee-for-service basis, it's going to make some people wealthy, some people well, but not enough of either of those things to be worth the bother.
Great, thank you so much. So let's launch into the panel substance itself. As a first question, I think it'd be very useful, for the audience to understand what is the current lay of the land in terms of the treatments that third-party payers are covering in this industry right now.
So I can take that. So right now, the currently only one that's really getting any sort of meaningful insurance coverage is esketamine. So Spravato, intranasal esketamine. And that, at first we were seeing a bit of resistance, but at this point, about a year and a half in, a number of payers are paying for that, although you have to go through quite a few steps to do that. For the most part, though, IV ketamine does not have kind of, FDA indications for psychiatric illness. And so that really is an uphill battle. And most people are paying privately for that, occasionally getting some out of network reimbursement, but it's really kind of few and far between.
Got it. Anything else?
Everything else is just trials, right? Drug trials that are separate.
One of the things that's important to understand is that in the world of outpatient mental health care, drugs being paid for and the administration of those drugs being paid for, if they have a monitoring period, are completely separate endeavors. And so you can have coverage for a medicine and still have it be not financially viable to ever deliver that medicine, which is a great way to not pay for it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And with esketamine, a lot of the codes that clinicians need to use to pay for like a facilitator's time may reimburse at like $7 an hour or something that's just not tenable. So oftentimes providers are having to negotiate contracts heavily to get certain codes paid for non-physician but face-to-face time. And that's been a real burden. So many clinicians have just sort of given up and offering this in their practices because they would lose money on it.
So as a follow-up, what would people find most surprising about the process of seeking payment for these treatments that they wouldn't necessarily know, or any myths that you would bust about it?
Insurance companies are convinced by data about effectiveness or savings. Myth. I think one of the things to understand about traditional third-party payers is that there's not just those entities. So we have Blue Cross, United, Cigna, Aetna, and they're heavily regulated. And one of the things we decided as taxpayers is that they would have a fixed profit margin of about 20%. And did anyone here do math in college? How do you get more money when you can only get 20%?
Raise the price.
Right. Yeah, it's not a complicated question. So the thing that drives insurance company profits when we're talking about the traditional third-party payers is increasing cost over time, which needs to happen relentlessly. So it's not about saving money, because at the end of the day, that's going to blow up their profit margin. If the costs go down, they only get 20% or less, and that destroys shareholder value. And that's a thing that they, frankly, shouldn't do. That's not the incentives of their investors and shareholders, to whom they have a fiduciary responsibility. And so figuring out how to align incentives so that doing things that save money makes sense means A, understanding that, and B, finding, for example, self-funded employers where they actually directly pay for the healthcare costs of their teams, and the secondary insurance markets that tranche out to capital markets that pay for those things, and aligning with them as an example of a way to do it. There are some other exceptions which require a lot of really granular knowledge about, say, dual eligible Medicare, Medicaid populations and their loss ratios, et cetera. But it turns out there's a lot of healthcare economics that I didn't think I'd have to know as a doctor that I definitely do. And the data on those things is really hard to get at. So thank you, Lucia, so much for building something that will collect any of that whatsoever.
The other big myth I would just kind of add would be that just because something is approved by the FDA does not mean that insurance will pay for it. We've seen this in TMS. So transcranial magnetic stimulation was cleared for OCD, And yet many, and that was over 2 years ago, many payers still aren't paying for it. We have to advocate, societies have to advocate for it. They want to see post-marketing data. But I think sometimes we think, oh, FDA approved, great, it's covered now. That's definitely not how it is. So people should anticipate those additional steps to get payers on board.
Yeah, just to jump in on there real quick, definitely. I think I totally agree with what Owen is saying. Like, payers are just not rational at all. They're not rational beings. And so exactly, no matter how much data you have, no matter how much money you could save them, they are still not going to get it sometimes. So it is an uphill battle, but hopefully, that's something that we're changing with being able to bring in better technology and eventually the data and the outcomes that are needed to prove things wrong or to work with more value-focused entities. But yeah, I think with what Carlene is saying, it's very much true. If a treatment is covered or approved by the FDA, they can apply for getting placed on a formulary with an insurance company. But oftentimes the insurance companies are going to be very conservative to start, so they won't cover it at all, or they'll give very poor reimbursement. And it's up to more data and more outcomes to be proven over the following years for payers to improve that formulary placement. Even then, it's not guaranteed. So it definitely is very much an uphill battle. And I'm glad Owen brought up the fact that there are organizations that are more incentive aligned, such as self-insured employers, who may be willing to cover things more quickly.
I'm going to just ask a couple follow-up questions based off stuff you said. And I just want to flag that I see that there are a couple audience questions that have come in, and I think that they're relevant to this particular question. So I'm going to ask those as well in the flow. And then if there are any other questions we don't hit upon, we'll save them for the Q&A session at the end. So touching upon one thing that you said in terms of myth that you would bust, Owen, if it's not necessarily just purely data and everything, what is compelling to third-party payers? I mean, how much are negotiations involved? Is there any other element specific to the patient or anything? What would you add in that regard?
Here's where being a psychiatrist is helpful. Being curious about the minds of the people you're talking to can help them feel comfortable enough to tell you what matters to them, or for you to kind of work it out from context. And so, one of the things that mattered in here is, look, relationships that are what we're building here, and relationships between specific people at insurance companies and the people in our field who are working with them go a really long way. One of the medical directors at Cigna is Doug Nemesek. He's been there for 19 years. And he, his previously was responsible for growing the network, and that mattered to him. And so we had something to offer him, which was a bigger network of in-network Cigna doctors. If we could talk about a contract that would get us, the ability to do more of the work that was important to us. And once we understood that, then suddenly data was much more compelling than it would have been otherwise. And so I think understanding that there are people involved, and whether you build that relationship or not matters, so that when the Clinical TMS Society comes and talks to Cigna, well, they might be talking to Dr. Nemesek or a number of other people he's talked to, and those conversations went better. And so when we're advocating for these treatments, we're educating and we're building relationships with individuals who make decisions who matter, and taking those individuals seriously, no matter what role they're in. I think of at Optum, they have someone in credentialing who has tremendous power, and understanding what makes sense to her can help you understand what makes sense to the whole organization. And so I'd say, get to know the people you're talking to as people, and that makes the whole process a lot easier.
Got it. All right, so let's move over to some of the audience questions that have come in. They're on point. So I'm going to read this ad verbatim. Is there an opportunity for non-psychiatry trained physicians to get involved in this movement? What are your thoughts of the year-long training programs provided by the Integrative Psychiatry Institute?
So I don't know about part 2, so I can't say. I would say that Carlene actually can probably talk about her work with Rubicon MD and how important it's going to be to get non-psychiatry trained individuals on the team.
Right. Yeah. With our work with Rubicon, which works with primary care, it's helping primary care with their psychiatric cases on the back end. And so I think educating kind of general physicians about the power of psychedelics, because, I think psychiatrists are not aware, primary care is even sort of more foreign. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And I think the other just big thing is with things like IV ketamine, we actually see a lot of people that are administering that are anesthesiologists, emergency medicine physician, pain physicians. And I think as psychiatrists, we really like to work collaboratively with them. And so practices that are able to set up relationships with a trusted psychiatrist and, not try to do the heavy lifting of the psychiatric evaluation, but work with somebody really makes sense, because you're not going to get like the training that we get in a psychiatric residency for things around suicide in, just like a 1-year kind of course, but you can still be definitely a big part of this.
Great. I see a couple more audience questions that come in, and I think they're going to touch upon stuff we're going to discuss later. So I'm saving those. Don't worry, we will circle back. Carlene, earlier you thanked Lucia in terms of how her technology is assisting with the process. So, my question is, how are different technologies such as Lucia is assisting with the payment process currently? Lucia?
Sure, I can start. Yeah, so in terms of what we do, so we've built an electronic health record that's really focused on innovative mental health practices. So practices exactly like Carlene's at Brooklyn Minds that are really excited about providing more breakthrough therapies to patients. So things like Spravato, ketamine, TMS, Zulresso, these more innovative treatments that may have been approved in the last couple of years. And I think with these therapies, it's really important to better understand how they work in the real world, because there's so much skepticism around if they even work or not. And so aggregating anonymized data is incredibly important to prove to insurance companies, to even prove to future drug developers that these therapies are highly effective and that more research is needed. So that's been a big goal of our software, is not only make it easier for clinicians like Carlene and Owen to go about their day, to chart on patients, to do the admin things that sometimes get in the way of caring for patients, but to ultimately help care for patients better and to prove that that care is really working well. So in terms of how the technology can actually help with future insurance coverage, we've done a number of things to help make it a bit easier for clinicians to adopt these therapies and for insurance companies to essentially get out of the way. So for example, this is not exactly related to insurance, but is related in the sense that it's a huge burden for clinicians, is the risk evaluation mitigation strategy that the FDA implements. So, for example, with Spravato, because it's administered in person, because it has dissociative sort of psychoactive effects, similar to racemic ketamine, the FDA requires a ton of monitoring, and Carlene alluded to that, in that the clinician or a nurse needs to oversee a patient for hours after the drug is even administered, and then they need to fill out all this paperwork and literally fax it to Janssen, to the drug manufacturer, who then faxes it to the FDA. So it's a huge burden. Sometimes clinicians are literally writing this out on paper or typing it in separately from their main set of notes, multiple times, dozens of times a day. So Janssen chose us as the first and only EHR to integrate all of that directly into the software to make it easier for clinicians to comply with those FDA burdens. And same with insurance companies. That's something that a lot of insurance companies are requiring, is some level of prior authorization or taking in baseline mental health questionnaires and post mental health questionnaires to show, to ensure and to check the boxes for these insurance companies. And so a lot of software and technology is needed for that. Otherwise, clinicians are resorting to have to write all of this out on paper. And that's just going to make it that much harder for them to provide these therapies for patients, because as Carlene said, if there are too many barriers for clinicians to provide it, they're just going to be like, no way, we're not going to do this. And it's understandable. So we want to be able to streamline all of that through the technology. But on top of that, I think, as Owen mentioned, transitioning to value-based care, that's a trend that we're all really excited about, and hopefully the major insurance companies are going to be picking up on that. And in order to do that, we really need to be able to better track outcomes. So I think a lot of software to date has not focused on actually providing better care and tracking outcomes for patients. It's more focused on like billing or admin or scheduling. And we really want to make sure that we can actually have clinicians better track patient progress. So rather than knowing exactly how patients are doing, in visit, how can we better track how they're doing out of their visit or in between visits, and sort of have this constant level of engagement and monitoring so that patients can get more tailored care when they're not in the physical presence of their provider. And so that's something that we've been trying to do through our technology, through integrating different data streams, through sending alerts to clinicians when they might need that help, and importantly, aggregating real world data. So if we can aggregate sort of outcome measures, clinically validated scales such as the PHQ-9 or the MADRS or the HAM-D, how can we then show that, if a patient gets a course of 6 ketamine infusion, their PHQ-9 score goes down by 10 points. That's really valuable information for payers to know, so that they can see how much money they might save by covering these types of treatments. So we're, Carlene mentioned, we're part of this task force for petitioning Medicare for insurance coverage of racemic ketamine. Racemic ketamine is FDA approved as an anesthetic, but it's not indicated for mental health conditions or pain conditions. So we're part of this group that's packaging real world data. We've got a bunch of clinics who have graciously volunteered to participate in this study. And we're running like a large meta-analysis on what the effective outcomes are of racemic ketamine. And we're putting that all together and sending it to Medicare in the hopes that they're going to actually reimburse IV ketamine or other forms of racemic ketamine. And because Medicare oftentimes sets the precedent for private insurers, hopefully that'll sort of snowball effect of racemic ketamine actually being covered and being more accessible to patients. So all in all, I think technology plays a really big part, and there are a lot of incredible organizations that are focused on allowing clinicians to actually see their patients and focus on patient care while collecting the data that's needed to make a case for these treatments.
Great, thank you, Carlene. Was there something you wanted to add to that? Okay. I think you touched upon this in general, Lucia, but I mean, if there's anything else, any other thoughts in terms of developments on the technology side? I mean, you talked about, value-added care, anything. Are there any other thoughts in terms of how you think that the technology will continue to improve other than the things that you touched upon?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of really cool things, innovations that are coming out. Like, I think, there in the past, there's been a lot of skepticism around the use of technology and wearables and digital data. There's definitely like an evil part of that I think has been sort of popularized by Facebook and these tech companies, but maybe there's a way to use it for good too. Like, what if there's a way for us to predict how patients are doing based on their sleep activity or their step count, or whether or not, they've engaged in social activity or gone out of their house, and be able to deliver more personalized care? If a doctor like Carlene could take a look at that sort of digital data and be able to reach out to a patient when they might need it and to recommend them to come into for treatment. I think that's all technological advancement that's coming our way. There was recently an article about this in the Wall Street Journal about sort of the rise of like big data psychiatry, and using data for good to be able to deliver more personalized care and ultimately get insurers to cover that as well.
Yes, that would be great if it gave more personalized care rather than Facebook somehow knowing what my wife or I were talking about and feeding advertisements exactly like 15 minutes later. We still can't figure that one out, but a little bit, concerning. So I want to shift things over a little bit, and I think some audience questions are really going to fit nicely into, kind of the next broad final topic we want to discuss is what existing roadblocks are there with payers that you think are going to be removed as impediments as things develop in the industry?
The existing roadblock I'm trying to remove with my team at Sphere is the payers, by being a different one. They have, by legislative fiat, massive incentives to do things wrong. And I don't think that they are built to move in the direction of truly value-based care in mental health at all. I don't think they can do it fast enough, and I don't think it's in the DNA of the companies. And so we built a different payer that vertically integrates care, making the right decisions and aligning with good outcomes for employers, patients, and their families. Because it turns out when you do that, you drive costs down pretty dramatically. So I think payers are the obstacle to payers, and plenty of people are still going to have to deal with fee-for-service payment because Medicare, Medicaid, even if we got rid of every private payer. So thinking about the fundamental underlying incentives, then getting to the economics, then getting to our excitement about the treatments, all these things we described as obstacles, they're opportunities for entrepreneurs. So Lucia saw like people writing things down on paper. That's dumb. And the solution to that is to make things easier for doctors, which means that they can aggregate yet more data. And that, is basically, what Tesla does with vector space while you're driving through an intersection. OSMIND would like to do with all of the data from a clinical encounter so we can render clinical space over time. With each and every encounter, you get more and more data, and you get to use an ahypothetical approach instead of asking people, well, what do you think is going to work? We actually get to have empirical answers to questions.
Yeah, I was speaking with a leader of one of the major Medicaid companies in the country, and I asked him basically sort of this question: is how we can move the needle. And he said, his company, a Medicaid company, is really going to move much slower than the self-funded insurance plans. So he said, if I were you, I would go to employers that have innovative mental health care plans, start deploying these innovative treatments, get data on absenteeism, presenteeism, overall use of disability, as well as the rating scales in these populations, and then they can be applied to larger Medicaid populations, Medicare populations, and some of the commercial payers. But I think that it is, as Owen said, an opportunity for more forward-thinking employers to think, how can I get these benefits to my employees? And I think we're seeing just sort of a major interest across health conditions, right? Across diabetes and cancer and all sorts of things. And I really think the psychedelics have a place to play in terms of comprehensive mental health benefits.
Got it. So Owen, you referenced earlier the legislative landscape and its impact, and that touches upon one of the questions from the audience, which is, to what extent would the decriminalization of psychedelic drugs at the state's level, not federal, begin to create access and coverage? In other words, the cannabis approach, still federally criminalized, but massive changes at state level. Essentially, what can we do at the state level to move the needle?
I am a physician. I care about public health. Putting people in jail for drugs is a public health problem. However, I've got a license from the DEA, which is from the federal government. So as someone dealing with sick individuals, I don't give an F what they decriminalize at the state level. Some people might, some people might not, but cannabis has a different thing going on than psychedelics, which is the effect size are not massive. And when you saw Dr. Williams present on Ibogaine, and you saw that top line number on PTSD symptoms that was 3.6, that is orders of magnitude greater than any treatments we have for any conditions in all of psychiatry. Usually we're talking 0.2, 0.5, a big effect size is 0.7. So if you want to see what an earthquake looks like in medicine, it's a 3.6 effect size. And the ability to change outcomes, and that means people's lives. They're suffering on a scale we have never gotten to experience before. I remember as a resident having to just adjust someone's effexor a little bit because it was the best treatment for PTSD we had in the Cochrane Review, and then white knuckling it week to week as I wondered if they'd get any better gradually over the course of weeks to months from the terrible suffering they were in. And that was, and frankly, is the state of the art for, telehealth platforms, et cetera. These interventional approaches with psychedelic medicines and, like Dr. Williams described, TMS, the amount of change is huge, which means the amount of value generated can be huge, which means we've got to get these things to be regulated at a federal level. And then we can get them paid for at a state level. I think the thing you do at the state level is you use the attorney generals to stick it to insurance companies on a state-by-state basis when they deny medically necessary care. So that's my strategy.
Yeah, I think Owen's talking about the concept of healthcare parity for mental illness. And that is a big kind of legislative lever that you can pull, right? If people are putting undue burdens at the state level on people getting psychiatric care, you can petition to the Attorney General. And we have done that successfully. Regarding cannabis, I think someone put in the chat about, Schedule I drugs. A lot of people, they want to get the prescription for cannabis, but then they discover their insurance does not pay for it. And it's actually much more expensive than should they get it on their own. So it sounds nice in theory, but in practice, as Owen said, we don't prescribe it, but those who do, most of my patients, they go for these consults. It's just not financially viable. And, insurance companies, they're not really looking at decriminalization. So we do think of it separately in its own right, but for us, it really is this federal DEA situation.
One thing I will say in reference to the cannabis thing, monitoring a lot of cannabis news, is that you are starting to see more litigation in which, employees are trying to force their employers to cover, cannabis medical treatments. There actually was an interesting case. I think they made it all the way up to New Jersey Supreme Court on that exact issue. So there's progress being made there, and hopefully down the road, that progress will assist also with psychedelic treatments. So I just want to check out some of the other audience questions. I think we kind of covered this because it talked about the federal level, just like Owen said. And actually touching base, Carlene, on what you referenced, it says, what about the fact that CMS will not allow insurers to provide coverage for Medicaid and Medicare for Schedule I substances regardless of cost? Obviously, this is a major factor. Perhaps you guys could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's why, for us, so sort of we kneel at the altar of the DEA, right? I mean, it's an imperfect organization, but we need them to change the schedules on these things if we want these kind of downstream effects where Medicare and Medicaid can pay for them. So that's where that advocacy really kind of comes into play.
And I'll put in another plug here too for the aggregate level research, because exactly, like for example, MDMA is Schedule I and is going to need to be rescheduled, and MAPS is working on that through these large scale randomized controlled trials. And so data is really needed to show that these treatments are safe and efficacious. And for example, with racemic ketamine, that's all anecdotally true. Clinicians know that, but how are we actually going to prove it to them? It's so hard to aggregate data when most of it just resides on paper or in someone's head. So we really need technology to go and aggregate and collect and make it easy for clinicians to contribute to research. And that way we can show that all of these drugs are worth rescheduling because they're both efficacious and safe.
Got it. So let's see next in terms of questions we have. What are your thoughts in terms of the role of legal advocacy in removing some of these roadblocks that we talked about, right? I mean, to a certain extent, it is based on the development and progress, as you said, MAPS, right, in relation to MDMA. And also, is there any function of, legal advocacy in terms of pushing this forward on the federal level?
So yes, is the short version. It's probably a whole other talk. The short version is the laws that ensure mental health parity are already on the books. They're not being enforced. So if you want to talk about enforcement strategies on a state-by-state basis or on a federal basis, feel free to give me a call, because there are definitely attorneys who are interested in this. United has been sued and lost in the Ninth Circuit twice now, and there are massive class action lawsuits coming at every other third-party payer for mental health parity violations. These treatments, because they're in psychiatry, are in the mental health parity boat. And so essentially every denial for prior authorization that you shouldn't have had to do in the first place, that is a claim waiting to go into a class action lawsuit, preferably in the Ninth Circuit, where we can, gradually over time present the overwhelming armada of legislative backed legal action that will, financially force payers to get in line, because right now they can afford to pay the fines. United makes billions a quarter. They get a $95 million fine or whatever it happens to be. And they're like, okay, that was Tuesday, next. So the actual size of the fines matters. And those get higher the more cases that are brought and the more egregious the behavior. And so I think any serious effort to get things to change on the payer level means we have to be aggregating data, not just about the efficacy of the treatments, but about the roadblocks to their implementation, because that changes the needle. And not for nothing, working in a value-based care model helps us more easily generate data about the efficacy that really backs up those legal challenges in court, when we can say, like, look, we've proven this is efficacious, and here are all the denials in fee-for-service land that we've gotten. That's a mental health parity violation.
And just a plug for the website, paritytrack.org. It is a go-to kind of destination for people having issues around parity in behavioral health. And it goes by different states, and will really kind of help and show if there's any kind of next steps people can take towards getting better coverage.
Great. With the time that we have left, I'm now going to shift over to some of the more general questions that we received from the audience. First off, one audience question is, I don't know much about payers and legal and all that stuff, but wouldn't the payers benefit from covering more products so that they could generate more money to increase their 20% profit margin?
the math gets really complicated here, but they're not bad at their job. And that's really important to understand. These are some of the most profitable companies on earth. And the way they do it is essentially by very, 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 very thoughtfully tranching what they're going to pay for and what they're not. And so sicker people generate over time more claims. And depression increases general medical spend 44%. So it doesn't matter how much your depression treatment costs. It's not going to be as much as that ICU stay. And so if on aggregate, your incentive is to have costs go up, keep depression in place. Sweet Lord, we need that depression there. That's a 44% bump in everything else we're spending on, because the real money is in rebates from pharmacy benefit managers for those tiers of medications that Lucia mentioned, right? And getting it in the right tier for the right biologic. Cosentyx, Humira, Enbrel, etc. There's massive amounts of money there. These small molecule drugs like MDMA, that's nothing. You pay them $20,000 for that. They're laughing on the way to the bank when they cash their, $250,000 a year checks for Cosentyx, much of which is rebated back to insurance companies through the safe harbor laws that make that payola perfectly legal rebates.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. Next,
if you're bored, that's on purpose, by the way, because that's how they hide the level of graph, by making it deeply complicated and boring.
Eyes glaze over. Yep.
You just peeled back the curtain there a little bit, Owen, huh? All right, let's see. One other question we have here. Can you talk more about the role of attorney generals in this? Now, I think they might be most likely referring to not necessarily just on the state level, but on the federal level. Any thoughts on that?
The short version is medical practices don't have the money or time to go out and hire lawyers, but your state employs a lawyer for the people of your state, which is the attorney general. So when patients have complaints about healthcare, they can make those complaints to the attorney general, and your medical office, without having to hire a lawyer, can support your patients and your practice in filing those complaints against third-party payers who violate mental health parity law.
Great. Next question. So this is an interesting one. Are patients hesitant to try psychedelics? What % of your patients would try it if it were legalized and covered? I'm going to tweak that, right? Because if they're already your patients, I'm guessing that they're probably more open to this. I would just say, with patients, in respect to the general public, people you interact with, what are your thoughts?
It's definitely changed. Like in our own practice, I think the number of cold calls we've gotten since January have gone way up. I think front page New York Times articles about psychedelics really help. And I think, we're seeing more conversations on social audio and social media from people just kind of all around the world saying, oh, wait, maybe I should, pay attention, right? And people like my dad, who's very conservative, never smoked a cigarette in his life, starts to ask if this is something he should look at for depression. Like, we've definitely made some inroads, and I think we're, almost there.
Briefly, behind me, you'll notice that's a framed reproduction lobotomy kit. That was a Nobel Prize winning intervention in psychiatry. And you laugh, but it won the Nobel Prize for a reason. People were hopeless and nothing else existed that could help. Psychiatry has 2 Nobel Prizes: the malarial cure for insanity, when we gave people malaria to cure their neurosyphilis, and the transorbital lobotomy, and that's it. It's time for some more, please. And I think psychedelic medicine, and maybe even TMS, like Dr. Williams is pursuing, maybe those massive changes, interventions, as is our heritage, that will help people suffer tremendously less.
I always like to call them, grandma stats and studies, right? Anything that comes out in psychedelics that I could use as ammo in a 10-minute conversation to convince a grandma about the value of this. They're not aware of the studies that were done in the 50s and 60s. And then unfortunately there was a long pause, and they're not necessarily aware of everything that's being shown now and the ability to scan brains and see some of these effects. So that's what I call them, grandma stats and studies.
John, just to throw you another one related to that, there was a survey of a couple thousand clinicians about if their patients had asked them about using psychedelics to treat mental health issues, and 47% of clinicians responded, said that they had patients ask them about it. So I think that would have been a very different number even a year or 2 years ago. And I think that trend line is exciting.
And it's probably not one guy asking every doctor, so study design matters.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a step-by-step process in making progress and changing public opinion, right? And changing the opinions of these payors. So we are out of time. So I just want to do a couple thank yous. So first off, I want to thank you, all the panelists, for participating in such a wonderful discussion. I want to feed your egos by telling you one comment that was shared by an audience member. Quote unquote, "This is one of the best conversations I have ever heard about this subject. Awesome passion and knowledge on show here. Bravo," smiley faced. No comment on the moderation. So, I guess that was a weak point. So thank you so much, panelists. I actually personally particularly appreciate the little smiles that Carlene and Owen, had when their spouses were talking and dropped a particularly good knowledge bomb. That was just nice, wonderful marital chemistry there on display for everyone. And I want to thank so much to our hosts, and thank you to the audience for attending. We hope that you found the panel as informative and enjoyable as that particular comment.
Well, when it comes to moderation, Jon, I'll just say that in our momentum chat in the background, we're all cheering for the great moderation of Jon. So thank you so much. You did a wonderful job, and you've got much praise happening in the background. And all of you speakers, we could let you go on forever. This is such a fascinating topic, and you really brought a wealth of wisdom and knowledge to the event. We greatly appreciate it. So thanks again for being a part of the day, and thanks to all of you. For our attendees, feel free to leave the session and make sure to give some feedback on your way out. In addition to any of the comments we already saw, I want to mention that we're going into a break, and we will have one of our lounge tables open for this break. The lounge is a place where you can join and connect with other people on camera with audio. So you can actually have that sort of round table, catch up, get to know each other feel. Just click on the lounge tab, join, give it permission for your camera and audio, and chat with your fellow attendees. And if you have additional questions, we'll invite our speakers to go there. We'll invite any attendees to go there. And we'll see you back here in an hour for our next session, all about taking a more community-driven approach to psychedelics. So that's at 1:45 Eastern. We'll see you then. Thanks, everyone.